My name is Melanie Stein. I'm a journalist, psychologist, and the founder of the NPO Wir sind der Osten, We are the East. And to be honest with you, one of the many, many reasons I wanted to found an initiative was that I wanted to create a work environment where people feel safe, where they feel seen, where there's space for creativity, where personal strengths are supported, because it used to not be as common in earlier days. So now I'm really, really curious, before we talk with experts who know how to build trust, who know how to make changes, I'd like to know, how do you feel that you can really be yourself at work? Can you dress how you want? Can you be how you want to be? Who would say, yes, I feel I can really be myself at work? Okay, that's the majority. I mean, it's a hard question, to be honest, because many people don't even feel they can be themselves around their friends, right? I have another question for you. When you think of your work environment, would you describe it rather like an atmosphere of trust or of control? Who would say it's rather trust? Please raise your hands. That's the very, very majority. Who would say it's rather control? That's a few. Who does not want to say? Okay, thank you so much. So I can see many of you know that trust is really important, and this is also what studies show. Studies show if you work in an environment of trust, when employees feel seen, people are more effectively, they work more effectively, they work more productively. For the people who just came, there's lots of seats in the back, so you surely find a seat. So, and now I'm very, very curious and very happy to talk to experts on how to build trust within companies. And the first panelist is the member of the managing board at Siemens. She is Chef People and Sustainability Officer and Labor Director at Siemens, and she has more than 2 decades of international experience in various HR. Welcome, Judith Wiese. Thank you so much. Yes. Also with us today is a woman who holds a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology. She is Senior Director of People Analytics and Research at WorkHuman. Welcome, Meisha-ann Martin. And I'm very happy that Kingsley Omeihe is here today. He is an associate professor of marketing and entrepreneurship at the University of West of Scotland. He is head of department at the University of Aberdeen and executive administrator at the Center for African Research on Enterprise and Economic Development. Mr. Omeihe, great to have you here. So, starting with Judith, you are responsible for approximately 300,000 employees worldwide. So, how important is trust in leadership, from your point of view?
We talked, before we came here, we talked about the power and the importance of language, and I like to refer them as people rather than employees, because I think if it's just the labor contract that defines the relationship
Oh yeah.
Sorry, let me start again.
Yeah.
So we had a side conversation before coming in here, which is about the power of language, and I like to refer to our people as our people rather than employees, because I think if I talk to you as someone who's only defined by the employment contract that you've got with us, that already sets a certain tone. Now, when we think about trust and leadership, I think it happens at different levels of the organization. So partly is what people see in the company as such. Yeah? Is Siemens a company that I trust? Do I think that Siemens is doing the right thing? And then you have, of course, the team environment, the team that pre-COVID we would have said, the team that you go to lunch with. So do I feel heard? Do I feel that I belong here? Do I feel that my opinion counts? Am I being accepted in the way that I am? And then we talk a lot about, do I have trust in myself these days? Yeah? Do I trust that I can deal with change? Do I trust that my skills are going to be relevant going forward? So am I going to be a resilient and a relevant human being who's employable, has skills that are sought after? And I think leadership needs to play at all these different levels. And I'm sure Meisha-ann is going to talk about psychological safety in teams. And I think we can later maybe talk a little bit about, how we instill trust in people themselves. But as an organization, I think it's very important to say, how do we do this? What are the values that we portray? Do we have values that people see us live up to? And there are many, and I'm sure we're going to touch upon that as well, many definitions of trust and leadership. The one that I always remember most easily and that resonates a lot with me typically has 3 ingredients. It's about reliability. Am I going to do what I said I would do? Competency or capability. Do people trust my capabilities that I can actually do something? And a level of intimacy. So is there something in our relationship that makes us close? And you need to play at all these different levels of the organization. And these, I would say, are universal levers or truths around what is helpful in building trust.
Yeah, we dive later deeper into the tools of how to build trust. You mentioned psychological safety before, Meisha-ann. What is it and how can we create it, and when is it not given?
So let's start with definitions, which as a psychologist, I love to level set on exactly what it is we're talking about. So psychological safety is a concept that was made popular by Dr. Amy Edmondson, and it refers to feeling like, you can be yourself without negative consequences regardless of who you are. So it has implications for, diversity in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity. Even if you are different from those around you, can you be yourself? Do you feel comfortable speaking up? Do you feel comfortable making a mistake, all without negative consequences? So that is what it refers to, and there are several ways to build psychological safety. One is through relationships. So in our research with my company WorkHuman, we find that there are a couple of things that are consistently related to psychological safety. One is checking in frequently with your leader. And in our research, we find that actually weekly is best. So checking in weekly is related to higher psychological safety, but also recognition. And that seems like a weird thing, like recognition related to psychological safety. But when we think about recognition, we think about it in terms of, I have acknowledged you, not only who you are, but what you do for this company. So I am sending a message through recognition that I see your unique capabilities and your uniqueness in terms of who you are and how you do what you do is appreciated here. And so when you think about it that way conceptually, it's a little bit easier to see how that constant acknowledgement of self, your capabilities, what you do and how you do it is related to feelings of higher psychological safety.
King, your research focuses maybe mainly on Nigeria and entrepreneurship in Nigeria, but before we talk about this, I'd like to know from you, why is trust as important within companies, but also with customers and between companies?
Well, thank you for that interesting question. I think it's always quite important to start off with why trust is important. And I think if we draw on one of the most important definitions of trust from George Siemens in 1959, he kind of points out that without trust in a society, the society itself would disintegrate. Now, the question is, what is trust? Trust is that set of shared expectations between two people in a relationship, within people within organizations, people and organizations, and within people and governments and people and institutions. And trust builds on three main dimensions: one, on the ability, on benevolence, and integrity. And if these things are missing in any relationship, then it's a disaster. Now, I always like to see trust as that fundamental lubricant that kind of shapes every social interaction. And the reason why we're actually here today is because we trust the Goethe-Institut to be able to pull together an interesting crowd and an interesting session to kind of explicate on issues around trust. Now, but within organizations, if you look at it within organizations, one of the fundamental aspects in shaping trust within every organization is leadership. But again, leadership has to be unique, because one, for trust to be able to work well in an organization, there must be trust on the leader. There must be trust from the leader to his people. So the leader must trust his people, right? The people must trust their leaders, and the people themselves must also trust each other. But again, if you look at some of the failures over the past years, as a result of a lot of distrust, or what I call trust violation. And trust violation is one when you've broken down on, when there's a break in trust. And once you break trust, distrust sets in. And distrust casts a shadow over any relationship. And there's an interesting research which the Elderman Research Group did. And what they pointed out was that within a society today, we are in the worst era, or worst trust era we've ever been in the past 50 years. Now, the reason is because, one, there's a lack of trust in institutions, there's a lack of trust in government, but more importantly, there's a lack of trust in the media, right? So when you have a lack of trust in institutions and a lack of trust in the media, the problem is, what are we going to do? So a lot of countries, so there's a famous author called Francis Fukuyama, and he spoke about high trust environment and low trust environment. And most of the countries that we are actually put in that high trust environment today appear to be shifting towards the low trust environment. And those in the low trust environment appear to be moving up to the high trust environment. In their research, countries like China and Dubai appear to be countries that are very high in trust. Because one, there's a high trust in the government, there's high trust in the media, and high trust in institutions. Again, look at Germany, for instance. Germany used to be a country that used to be very high on trust. But from today, it's very hard to define Germany as a very high trust environment. And if I ask everyone in this country, in this hall today, do you trust the German government? I would argue the responses might be varied. If I ask them, do they trust the German media? I would argue that the responses may be also varied. But again, there are actually aspects for us to also rebuild trust. And I suspect the conversations will lead on to how can trust be repaired. So I'll probably stop at this point and hand over back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Of course, we really want to dive deeper into what happens when we lose trust and how to regain it. But before we do that, Meisha-ann, you have already talked about that it's so important that people can really be who they want to be. And Judith, but I'm really curious to learn more about how you can really create this atmosphere, because people are so different. Some are very skeptical, some trust very easily. So how can you meet these different needs?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, at the end of the day, it comes down to very few things that will either build trust or destroy trust. And as many companies have also learned the hard way, it's much easier to destroy trust than to build trust. It takes a much longer time to build it, but you can lose it overnight. I would like to maybe before I answer your question, I'd like to go back to organizational level, because the Edelman Trust Barometer that you were referring to, interestingly enough, says that the organization type that people trust most these days is businesses, is organizations, is their employers. And I think partly that is because people felt lost in globalization, or felt that, whilst national institutions in a globalized world are only so meaningful or effective anymore, businesses still maybe. Yeah. And of course, people have a much better view on whether the company really is reliable, capable, and creates a level of trust and intimacy inside. And so one of the things that we've experienced at Siemens is that whilst we always had good engagement, it's really jumped through COVID times. And I think that's down to two things. One is people saw that the company really does care in terms of how we're taking care of our people. So there's proof points again. Yeah, okay. So the company values on the website or on the company walls, you really live up to that. Yeah, I see you do that. I see you do that here in my immediate surroundings, but I see that for the rest of the company as well. And the other one is that COVID, of course, has tipped us into an environment where even the last doubters had to lead with trust because many people were home. Yeah. So and we all saw that the world doesn't fall apart. Quite the opposite. Yeah? Actually, people are highly productive when they have a certain degree of self-determination around what they're going to do when, and that they will act in the best interest of the company more often than not. So those were things where I think the organization did a huge jump in overall as a company. But I think again you can break that down to individual relationships as well. And one of the things that we do at Siemens and have been doing for a long time, as many other companies do as well, is we do something that we would call structured listening through engagement surveys. And of course here we also ask all these questions. Yeah? Do I feel that my line manager supports me? Do I feel that in our team we can have certain conversations? Do I feel accepted in who I am? Am I supported in my development? So those are all questions that we ask and that we want to hear the answer to. And then again, it's very important that we don't, make decisions upon that at headquarter level, but that again, team by team by team, you sit down and have those conversations about what it means for us, and that there is meaningful action and follow-up around that. So again, the reliability of, we're making commitments and we're following up on our commitments.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's interesting, Judith, is that Kingsley and I were having this conversation last night, and it seems like we all agree that the organization is now the institution that people trust the most because of the vacuum left from distrust of other institutions. But to further answer your question, I said before in the previous question that a weekly check-in between a leader and their direct report is related to the highest psychological safety. And we find that in our research. However, how you have these conversations matter. And I think one of the opportunities that I've seen in many organizations throughout my career is that there is a lack of guidance around how to have these good conversations. So, in my company at WorkHuman, we've started talking about checking in on the person instead of just checking on what they're doing for the company. And that nuance in how you have that conversation is very, very important. For that conversation to be most trust building, making the connection between two people the best that it can be, there needs to be some vulnerability there, because you can ask somebody how they're doing, but they have to trust you enough to really tell you how they're doing. And so what I recommend to leaders is that they set the tone for the vulnerability that's required to have a great conversation. How do you do that? Not by emotionally dumping on your employees and telling them things they don't need to know, not that, but you do want to be honest. If you're feeling stressed, maybe you can admit that. If you are feeling challenged with something you've been asked to do at work, say that. If you had trouble getting your little one out the door that day, maybe say that. And so what that does is that lays a foundation for people to be equally honest with you, for them to say when they're struggling with something you've asked them to do. So that gives you the opportunity to provide further guidance and support. And this is how trust between two people in an organization is built. And what we need to remember, I think, is that this relationship between leader and the person that reports to them is foundational to how somebody experiences the organization. It is the first important relationship, and that relationship starts with good conversations that are happening frequently.
We have learned that trust is very important, but would you say are there also constellations when control is necessary or when mistrust is even important?
Okay, I think it's a bit difficult to say that for mistrust to be important, but again, I like to use the word trust, distrust rather than mistrust. But in terms of distrust, like I earlier mentioned, right, it's easier to build trust, but it's very difficult to repair it. And once trust has been violated, there must be a series of steps to repair trust. And if you violate trust once, it's easier to repair. But if you continue to violate trust consistently, it makes it very difficult. Now, one thing about trust is unique in its own element. And just like Meisha mentioned, it kind of embodies that psychological aspect. And I like to see trust as that socio-psychological, quasi-religious suspension. So it's a suspension whereby I believe that you would act in a way that is benevolent, you would act in a way that is expected, but more importantly, you act in a way that has a lot of integrity. And in my research, what I found out about trustworthiness is that trustworthiness is made up of a subset of good character, it's made up of a subset of integrity, and again, moral disposition. Now, when you find most societies, we find out that one, just like Judith mentioned, the organizations have evolved to kind of replace the weak government, or what I call dysfunctional government. So people look to their organizations to champion trust. They look to the organizations for the real and right information because, one, it's very hard to take the information or the guidance of government as the truth. Now, similar cases also appear in Africa. So I do a lot of research in Africa, and what I've come to realize is that there are lots of weak formal institutions. So that, one, most of the business people, or what I say, the local traders, do not believe in formal institutions. So what they do now is they look to other, what I call alternative institutions, or what I call indigenous institutions, as an alternative for weak formal institutions. So for instance, in the research that I did somewhere in Africa, I realized that most of the traders, right, like to work with members in social ties. They like to work with religious institutions. They like to work with family members because, one, they kind of provided those safeguards which fundamental government institutions don't do. So in a scenario where they actually have trade arrangements, they don't look to contracts because, one, contracts do not really help them govern their trade. And when they go to courts, the courts are perceived to be for the rich and those that have got lots of connections. So they look at alternative institutions like market local associations that they actually have trust in. And this actually helps them do their trade and do their business as well. So I think it takes us again back to the antecedents of trust. I think for us, before you trust, there must be that vulnerability. So that is, I'm going to trust you, but I'm hoping that you will keep to your own end, right? There's going to be that expectation of benevolence. I expect you to behave in a way that is benevolent. Now, once those things do not work, then distrust sets in. And trust violation is always a challenge of any organization, any society, and any relationship. I was leaving Glasgow yesterday, and I told my wife I was going to be away for 3 days. And there's something she said, I trust you. You know, and for me, it meant a lot. Okay, does she trust me? Why does she trust me? Perhaps she trusts me well because she knows I've got the ability to take care of myself and not do something that is wrong, right? She expects me to behave in a way that is expected, and she also expects me to be benevolent. And I think that actually has happened at the micro level, right, between me and my wife. And it can also be replicated at the meso level, right, within organizations. I believe my leaders, I believe my organization should have the ability to do what they're supposed to do. They should have the benevolence to do what is right, a good character, good moral disposition. They must also have the capacity to show integrity. And at the macro level, we expect the government to say, well, this is what we're going to do, and this is right. Right? We are benevolent, we're going to do what is expected of us. We've also got that integrity. But the argument is it's very difficult to actually pinpoint any major government that we could actually argue is a very trustworthy one. I'll stop at this point.
Maybe I'll chip in on the notion of control because I think it depends on, again, how you define control. I don't think that trust and control are necessarily polar opposites. If we're going to have a fire here, hopefully not, we're not going to have a consensus, a kumbaya around how we're going to leave the building. We want somebody to know exactly how we're going to leave this building to be safe. So there is something around situational leadership as well, where sometimes it is important to know who's in charge and what the rules are of getting us safely out of here. And control in the sense of governance is something that's become more and more important because it has to do with transparency and whether we think that somebody checks in on whether the data being presented, information being presented is really truthful. Take greenwashing and the things that we talk about from a sustainability context these days, where we want to trust that people really, when companies and organizations really show us data that is truthful data. So governance in that sense is something very good. And even at an individual level, because in Siemens we talk a lot about growth mindset, empowerment. But empowerment has two sides of the coin. It's about people, it's about trusting people that they will take the right decisions, but it's also people taking accountability. And when I trust you to take decisions, I think it's important that I tell you within which framework you're empowered to take a decision, which rules otherwise apply. And so again, it's about contracting up front to say, these are the boundaries, this is the freedom, within that I trust you. But without that, it can even become damaging or less meaningful. And of course, wherever people come together, small or in countries or big organizations, you need certain rules of the road, and you do hope that somebody governs them as well.
I like that thinking about control in organizations as governance, because I will admit when I first heard control in organizations, I was like, oh, that doesn't belong there. But the way you explained it, actually it does, right, in terms of governance. But where it doesn't belong is in things that would benefit from innovation, right? Because when you're dealing with people and the tasks that you've asked them to do, the more you control how they accomplish that task, the more you stifle innovation. So I would say, be really careful there if you're a leader in terms of how you communicate what somebody is supposed to accomplish. So if you want innovation, maybe less control in the strict sense. Of course, sometimes governance is needed. I do also want to address the part about when you break trust. We are all humans, and humans make mistakes. So one of the most important things to do to recover from that is to admit that you've made a mistake and acknowledge that you've broken trust, and commit to rebuilding trust. I don't know how many of you are religious in here. I'm not really, but sometimes people talk about forgiveness, and in my personal relationships, I think, okay, but if you haven't acknowledged the wrong, I'm less likely to forgive you because I can't trust you not to redo that same thing that was damaging to me. And so when you're thinking about relationships in organizations like that, when you've broken trust, it is so important to be vulnerable, admit that you've done that, and commit to doing differently in the future.
Yeah, when maybe one example here for a company. I mean, you mentioned that people lose more and more trust in governance, in media, and that actually companies can build even more trust. But there are, of course, examples of companies who lost trust. And one example I observed was Twitter lately. I'm a journalist. Many people who are journalists or politicians use Twitter. And someone was buying Twitter who shared fake news, for instance, or who is known for having very conservative views. And many people said, okay, I'm leaving Twitter, I'm out, bye. So what could, in this example, what could Elon do to win trust back?
Well, I think firstly, it's quite difficult to identify which news outlet is a trustworthy one, because in my research, what I've kind of found out is the leading media outlets in the world are owned by politicians and business people, right? And what they do is they use their power and their wealth to buy those media outlets and use them as propaganda outlets. So what it means is that if you are getting this information from this particular media outlet, it is based on the philosophy and the underpinning aspects that actually shape that the leader actually has. So it's the leader funneling the information and the philosophy that he wants people to engage in. So that is why you see in different countries, you see the most powerful people are actually the owners of the media outlets. And for you as a government, if you want to be in the good books, you need to be in a good relationship with those media moguls. Now, it's in the case of Twitter, I would argue that it's the essence around Twitter is to have like a collective space where people could argue, people could share viewpoints. I think for me, I would not say Elon Musk is actually doing something wrong. I think for him, what he's always wanted is an environment whereby people can actually discuss and bring some neutrality in the media or in the news, which he argues has not been there in the past 5 years. And I'm not saying he's doing a great job, but the truth is, there appears to be some kind of benevolent philosophy around that. He might not be doing it in the right way, in an organized way, but there appears to be some bit of direction. But again, it's open for conversations. But again, how do you rebuild trust? And I think that's an important aspect. How can trust be rebuilt? And I think Meisha kind of mentioned it, right? Trust can be rebuilt through two ways, right? Reconciliation and rebuilding. And reconciliation and rebuilding are underpinned by one, apologies and verbal explanations. And I think those can actually happen in the short term. And when you are open to apologies and verbal explanations, especially immediately when that trust violation has occurred, that it kind of makes more sense. But if you leave that to linger for a long time, it becomes very difficult to repair it. But again, some would argue that verbal explanations and apologies may not be enough. Right, so what do we do, right? So you need to demonstrate that empathy. You must show actions, right? Okay, I've done this wrong. These are the steps which we need to do, which we actually put in place to ensure that we repair trust. People need to see those concrete actions. Verbal apologies, yes. Explanations, yes. But what actions have you put in place, right? So trust repair is quite important. But if you are able to do those timely interventions immediately after the trust violation, then it kind of goes a long way. But again, it's kind of difficult to see that in our space because one, we have governments, we've got institutions that are not quick to apologize. There are institutions that are not quick to say, yes, we've made a mistake and we're sorry. It's very difficult because they feel, well, if that happens, that could affect our stock prices. But again, if there's a lack of trust in any society, just like George Simmel says, the society itself will disintegrate. And I think with this conversation we should be having is how can we repair trust? How can we ensure that trust is a worthwhile construct or concept in our daily lives, in our societies, and in our organizations?
Judith, can you give maybe an example when Siemens or another company you've been working for lost trust and how you regained it?
I'm not sure that I actually have a personal example, but I think we all know instances in history where companies let their customers down or their consumers down, and I think there are some very prominent examples of where that happened. And then I think Kingsley is absolutely right. The question is how do you rebuild the trust and what's the promise? And maybe one comment on Elon Musk. I'm not even sure that there is alignment on what is the promise he's giving. I think his promise in terms of what Twitter is very different to the promise that Twitter gave beforehand. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I think that what's happened is a fundamental shift in what that organization's purpose actually is.
So how would you describe the promise he's giving?
Well, I think his idea of free speech is a very different one to the previous Twitter leadership. Yeah. So therefore, there's already a complete different understanding at a very fundamental point. So therefore, what your little tick means in terms of authentication, what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. We talked about control or governance earlier on. The previous Twitter did governance in a different way on how that medium was used. Now the new leadership has a different definition of what is good and where the boundaries are. So I think it starts with the promise that you're making, and to what extent that promise is understood and then lived up to. And like I said earlier, I think it takes time to build trust. You can lose it in an instant, and any organization, any relationship that has broken trust will need the transparency, the commitment, and the reliability that you really go after. I said what we would do, what we said we would do. So I think that is universally true. But any organization, any product, any brand needs to have an understanding of what is the promise that I deliver, and do I live up to that? That can be quality, that can be sustainability, it can be many things. And then the question is, how do you live up to that, and what are you willing to also show? Where are you gonna let your pants down and also be willing to be held accountable? And that's what a lot of companies do today, and that's why, rightly so, the requirements around governance, regulations, and what you need to show are very different to what it was 20, 30 years ago. And then the question is, by which values do you live yourself? I mean, if we take the recent example of, who stays in Russia for how long and why, there's been different answers from businesses on that, and there's been blaming and shaming lists of, whether you belong to the good ones or not in the perception of the beholder. Yeah. So, but these are things where organizations need to internally have a dialogue, but also externally have a dialogue with their audience. And the way that we look at it at Siemens is we have in our degree, in our ESG framework, the word ethics as well. We have some ethical principles. We have business code of conduct. We have supplier codes of conduct. But most importantly, we're facilitating dialogues, because I think in today's world, nothing or hardly anything is ever black and white anymore. So really what you need to do is to solve dilemmas of conflicting values, of conflicting directions, and again, the trust is in that dialogue happens, and that wrestling with something that is actually really difficult to decide is happening. And this is a way of building trust internally, but then also building trust externally with your various stakeholder groups.
Meisha-ann, what would be your advice to Elon Musk?
Oh my goodness, I'm so biased on this one, honestly. I do not trust or like Elon Musk. We live in the same city. My advice to Elon Musk really would be to go away, but I don't think that's the answer you were looking for. But that's my real answer.
And if he would ask you for advice?
I would say, to Judith's point, be clear about what your intention is for Twitter and how that differs from what it used to be. Put something out there that lets people know what they should expect from Twitter as an organization and a platform, and invite them to hold you accountable to that. And that way, if you don't agree with his intentions, you can self-select out, right? But then the people who do agree, they're like, okay, this is what I'm looking for. This is what you're consistently delivering. I can trust you to deliver on what you said you were going to deliver on. But Elon and I won't be speaking, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, another big topic is the speed of innovation, right? We live in a time when there's so many changes. So, Judith, how can employees trust, especially the older ones, that they're still needed in the future?
So maybe I'll do what I did at the very beginning. I'll call you on some of the language or the positioning. I mean, in the US, we're probably going to have an election between a 77-year-old and an 80-year-old. So I think our own notion of age meaning something very positive and experience, or age meaning something that you self-select yourself out of the market, the talent market, we really need to be careful with that, because in my view, the ability and the willingness to learn at the end of the day is something very personal, and I think it applies to all age groups. So the question is more about how do you encourage people to keep on learning, and for those who are in environments that have been very stable for a long time and who got out of the habit of learning, how do you actually make it easier, and how do you lower the barriers of doing that again? I always use the example of my children. My children have gone, because I dragged them around the world, to many different school systems. There are systems that taught them knowledge, and there are systems that taught them how to learn and how much fun learning is. And in the workplace, this is exactly what we need to do again. It takes psychological safety. It takes it takes creating the space so that people really are supported to learn. But we've got some really wonderful examples of where we have trained unskilled or people with relatively little qualification or dated qualification, and we brought them back into learning and helped them to get onto a path where they learn competencies that will get them fit for the future again. And if you think about it, with the pace of technological change, with the level of unprecedented things happening, the biggest gift I think we can give to people, and as companies we have a big role to play, is to say, can you embrace change as something that you don't have to be afraid of, that you take as something positive, and can we give you the confidence to learn? And we talk a lot about growth mindset in that regard. But we've, for instance, done very symbolically away with classic performance management and introduced something that we call growth talks, again to send a symbolic signal also to the organization that learning is important. We make it important. We have KPIs around learning because you get what you inspect to a certain extent as well. And those are symbols of what you make important in an organization. So I think we need to help lower the barriers. We need to help people get into the habit of learning. And then, of course, as a company our size, we have so much learning infrastructure that people can tap into that we're quite privileged in that regard. But it really comes down to the individual and whether the individual feels that it's safe to do that.
Yeah, then maybe to put it into other words, of course there are people who are very curious and who love learning, and you mentioned the growth mindset, but there are also people who need more safety and stability. So how do you address them?
Yeah, again, it goes back to a lot of what Meisha-ann said about psychological safety also in that regard. And very often it's nice to see what role not only the line leader plays, but also the role that peers play. So in the example that I gave earlier, we actually had our young apprentices help the ones that hadn't seen school for 25, 30 years and to help them get back into the groove. They helped them prepare for their exams. They gave encouragement to each other. Or I'll give you another example. We have now got a few people on the shop floor that are augmented with little learning nuggets they can do in 5 minutes on the line through technical devices, and they can take those technical devices home as well, which gives them a sense of pride, and again they feel, I'm trusted with this, I'm going to do that. And a lot of the time it is about bringing learning to the people rather than people having to go somewhere. So the way that people in the workplace learn today is very, very different. It's typically bite-sized learning. Yeah? So you don't send them off for 2-week courses. You give them bite-sized learning that they can do either in their own time and or very close to where work actually happens. And that's the magic formula, if you like.
So a couple of things here. On the first part of the question around innovation, I want us to not forget the very documented relationship between psychological safety and innovation. And fundamentally, what it says and what it means is if I feel safe to speak up with my ideas, then creativity and innovation follows, right? So it is a safety to go against the grain and to speak up with an idea that may be really, really different from how everybody else is thinking. So the relationship between those two is well documented and works well. There is actually an interesting set of research done by Google called Project Aristotle. And if you know anything about Google, Google hires the best and most talented, and their interview process is insane. So they embarked on this research project to figure out, what makes for the most successful teams. And one of the things I love about how success was determined, it's not just how successful the team thinks it is, but also included in that metric is how successful do the leaders of this company think that team is. So there was some kind of external validation of success that made me trust that research. Now you just know that Google was intending to find that, our selection process, the teams with the most talented people perform the best. It was not that. It was the teams with the highest psychological safety performed the best. And I think that was really fundamental to the emerging conversation on psychological safety, was that foundational research. Now, on the topic of age, I've seen some of the things that you've talked about in terms of, really being creative about people who are further along in their career. So I went to Kohler a couple of months ago, and one of the things they do is they bring alumni back to do site tours, and I thought that was really interesting. And then the last thing I'll say about this is, with WorkHuman, we just published, so me and some other researchers on my team, we just published this paper called The Evolution of Work, where we're looking at different people in the workplace and what they need. And I just, I don't really care for generational research. I think that's a bit short-sighted. So that body of research in that paper was more about what do people need based on their stages of life, which is not the same as your generation, right? And so the question becomes not necessarily about older people, but about people who are winding down their careers and how to keep those people engaged. Also, people who are ramping up. When I was head of talent experience for a company called ServiceMaster, one of the things I did was, for the things that you had access to in our learning platform, you could learn anything. I was like, let's open up anything to anybody. And that way, if you're an executive assistant and you want to be a computer programmer, take the programming classes and internally certify yourself and switch your career within our company. We welcome that, and we welcome you. So just a couple of ideas there.
Because we don't have as much time, maybe you can combine two questions, your answer now, and because I'm also really, really curious what European entrepreneurs can learn from Nigerian, African entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. So that's 4 questions, because you've got the innovation question and the age question, and you've got the other question on the entrepreneurs.
You can handle it. I trust you.
So I think I'll handle it. So that's 3, 4, 5 minutes. So I think first things first, I think there's a strong correlation between innovation and age, but there's a stronger correlation between innovation, age, and leadership. And if you look at the most successful, innovative companies, companies that actually have a strong leadership. But strong leadership, again, there's a question mark there, because the truth is, what we get today is a prevalence of what I call authoritarian leaderships, and across institutions, across organizations, and at a macro level. But the most successful leaders are leaders that apply what I call authentic leadership. And authentic leadership is that leadership that kind of combines aspects of transformational leadership, whereby they can actually transform the organization and transform the capacity of the employers or the employees. A servant leader who shows how it's done and is a servant and actually shows, well, I can do this and I expect you guys to do this. A leader who is charismatic, who has a way to convince and motivate and inspire people. Now, and also a leader who kind of who's able to combine this aspect. I think that's what authentic leadership does, right? And that kind of permeates into a learning organization. And a learning organization is an organization whereby innovation thrives. And how can innovation thrive? Innovation can only thrive whereby the there is a lack of control. So I like to always take out that, dislocate that control aspect, but ensure that the ideas do not necessarily come from top down. The ideas must also come from down up. Now, the most successful organizations, the Instagram, the Google of these days, Amazon, right? What they do is they champion the empowerment of the younger generation, right? Because they've got great ideas. I speak to my son. My son is 8 years old, and he talks to me about the metaverse, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? But it shows you how much these kids and how much the younger generation are at a different level. My son can tell you what AI is and the difficulties of AI. So you can imagine within the organization, if you try to stifle those competencies, you would struggle. In the olden days, and previously, we used to have the companies like Nokia. And we used to have Nokia and Motorola. They used to be the big phones. They used to be the Apple and Samsung of those days. But one thing they lacked was the lack of innovation, and they felt too complacent, and they became what I call dinosaurs, right? And the BlackBerry came up, right? It built on innovation, it built on the age of its own people, and tried to work against build on the limitations of Nokia and Motorola. But again, they also became very complacent. And the likes of Apple and Samsung have come. And what they've done is that continuous innovation, ensuring that they build innovation, but ensuring that they actually build a learning environment whereby innovation not necessarily comes from the control, from the leadership, but also comes from the junior leaders within the society, but again, empowering them. Now, your other question about entrepreneurs in Europe and entrepreneurs in Africa, I think it kind of takes us back to an aspect of trust. And some of the debates around trust is trust the same across board? So it's called the ethic view of trust and the emic view. So the concept is trust the same across board? So other scholars believe that the same trust you get in the West is the same trust you get in other continents, other countries. Now, there are other scholars who actually argue that trust is different. That the trust you get in the West is different from the trust you get in Africa. And for me, I always felt, well, trust was universally the same. But in my research across other emerging markets, I realized that trust, yes, can be universally general, but trust can also be context-specific. So I'll give you an instance. So I realized that within emerging markets, especially take Africa, for instance, right? There's trust built based on culture. There's trust built based on family ties. There's trust built based on religious ties. There's trust built on ethnic ties. And these things, as a result of socialization, it kind of shapes the way people do things and people act, and also replicates the way entrepreneurs act. But then, if you look at it from the entrepreneurs in the West, I think the idea around having trust as an entrepreneur in the West is that you must be able to build two things. One, reputation. Reputation is quite important in building trust. You must ensure that your interactions are positive, because people trust you based on previous interactions. Oh, I can do business with him because, one, I know he's trustworthy. So those interactions need to be strong, need to be positive, and they need to be consistent. Because, one, a break in trust defeats the entire relationship. So, one, building trust is important, but there must be that consistency. And one thing you get in terms of reputation, right, as an entrepreneur, is reputation matters a lot, right? Because once there's a reputation damage, it affects the need for people to do business with you. So that is why it's quite important to build that trust, maintain that reputation, and ensure that you abide to trust, because trust, like I always say, is that essential lubricant that actually cements any relationship. So I'll kind of stop at this point.
Thank you so much. We have a little bit of time for your questions now. So who wants to ask something? Yeah, thank you. I take this one? Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe you can introduce yourself and then ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Mercy Dokazotieno, and thank you for having me, and thank you for the very interesting conversation. I have two questions. One, trust is the bedrock of the society. And yesterday when we had already the same session, it really lingered in my mind yesterday, and I was thinking a lot about it. But I thought that maybe trust can, because family is an institution, regardless of what type, patchwork, it doesn't matter. But I feel like if we don't incorporate trust in the family institution, then we have a lot of, because we make out the population. But if we have people that don't trust, then you have the same problems in the organization, politics, everywhere. So I felt maybe there can also be an innovative way of even putting trust as a subject for families, for kids, that they grow up trusting themselves, trusting who they are, so that in the future we have leaders who know what they're doing. Then the society, I think even globally, it's gonna be a more easier way, because if I come into your company to work and I don't trust myself, it coming from home, you can do as much as you can as a boss, but the mistrust comes from somewhere else. That's the first perspective. The second one is what happens in an organization when it comes to the outer, like when it comes in the media, we are totally successful. I come from performing arts, I'm an actress. So we stand on stage, we play, everything is fine on the outside. But internally, there are problems of I don't feel safe psychologically. If I say something, am I gonna keep my job? Does the boss like me? Am I gonna get the role? If I see something not working in the organization, am I bold enough to say something? I thank God I'm bold enough to talk. It does not matter. But I realize that there's some people are different in their character and how they are, but they're not able to speak their mind. So in positions, and the boss is going to say, no, but we're successful. We're successful everywhere. But internally, there are things that are not working right. So in such kind of a situation, how can we create for colleagues and for even with the boss and say, hey, there is organization toxicity going on that people cannot really grow and speak their mind, because when I understand right, if there's that psychological space to talk, then I can be creative and do something. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd ask you for a very short answer. We only have 4 more minutes.
I'll just take the first one. I think those two questions are quite important. And I think one of the problems we have in the society today is what I refer to as the disintegration of the family system. Now, the family system across board, not just in the West, generally is almost disintegrated. And what you get is people don't really want to see the family again. And I don't know why that is so, because the truth is the family is the first institution. And just like Hofstede has mentioned, it's where we get the fundamental values, the norms, and those ethics that guide you as an individual. But again, the society in which we are has changed, has evolved, not for the better, I would say. And you find single families, and you find families without a father figure and a mother figure. We find youths today who don't actually believe in the family system, and they're always very careful. They don't want to get married. So again, it's very difficult to instill those values, because one, the bedrock of every society is the family. And once you're able to cement and start reorientating children at a very early level, those value system, those norms, those good moral disposition lives with them. My father used to tell me that you have the first 10 years to train your son or your daughter. You've got the first 10 years. Tell them what they need to know, give them the differences between right and wrong, and support them. And after the first 10 years, they will be great champions of the society. So absolutely, I do agree with you. There's a need for us to, again, see how we can reintroduce the family system, support the family system, create incentives for that family system to grow. Now, the issue around toxicity within organizations, yes, I do agree with you. A lot of organizations, they come out and they champion a fantastic facade, saying, oh, we are doing the great stuff. But within the organizations, there's a horrible culture. Most organizations come out and they do great things outside, but within the system, there's a great culture. A lot of them have that breeding toxicity within the organization. A lot of them don't actually even pay less than minimum wages, use sweatshops. Now, the assumption is, how can we rebuild cultures within the organizations? Most organizations have become very proactive in terms of rebuilding culture, right? They actually assign mentors. They have workplace arenas whereby they can actually discuss and probe ideas. But again, ensure that they have leaders who understand the vision of the organization and are able to promote a great and a fantastic culture. I worked at one bank, and I realized the average number of people in that bank in terms of turnover was 2 years, right? But I also worked in another institution, a university, and I realized an average person there has spent 25 years. The question is, why have they spent 25 years? It's because it's a great culture. So I'll stop there because of the time.
Yeah, maybe if we don't have much time left, but I'd love to hear all of you on this last question.
So very quickly, I want to acknowledge something that you said that I've been thinking about a lot recently is coming into an organization with trauma and how that manifests and how you respond to whatever positive environment the organization provides. It's a legitimate point, and I think we haven't thought and talked about that enough. I do a lot of research on, the impact of positive person-to-person acknowledgement. And if there's one thing I want you all to think about today as you're thinking about how to build trust as individuals, when you speak positively about somebody else, about your child, about your mother, about your husband, ask yourself, did I ever tell that person that directly? And the answer is often no. But when you do that and when you get in the discipline of doing that, it will transform your personal relationships, I promise. And then the second thing is, if you work in a toxic organizational environment, take advantage of the survey listening program. If you don't feel safe in one-to-one conversations, we talk about the importance of voting. That organizational survey is your opportunity to vote and voice within your organization. So I recommend that you use it.
Yeah, and maybe just a brief one from me to finish up on that. I think as an organization, you work with people who are grown-up people by the time they arrive, and so therefore what you can do is signal what expectations you have, but also what kind of support you're going to give. So a leadership training is not just a leadership training. What you put on the curriculum signals what this organization expects of somebody who's been entrusted with people. The other thing that I would say is maybe slightly tangential, but is important for me. One of my favorite quotes is Kofi Annan, who said, "You're never too young to lead and you're never too old to learn." So I think we also need to revisit what we call leadership, because very often we have a tendency to look up. Because leadership happens where we don't sit, and the question is, what can I take on? Siemens is led by 5 board members for 311,000 people. If we had all the pearls of wisdom, and if we were the only ones who had, the wisdom on ultimate direction, we'd be poorer for not tapping into the wisdom of the organization. And for me, therefore, leadership happens at all levels, and leadership is also leadership of ourselves. If you really follow, and there's lots of research behind that as well, if you really follow the logic of growth mindset, you can be almost anything that you apply yourself to. And that is very empowering, actually, because that doesn't make you a victim. And quite honestly, and that would be my last sentence, we are having an era of demographic change that people are now seeing. It's a bit like climate change. Now it's in our face. Doesn't happen, not true for all countries, but for many. People will just vote with their feet. If they will leave toxic organizations. They will love them, try to change them, but they will also eventually leave them if they are not happy where they are. And so I think that should also be encouragement to all of us to say, let's create something that's good and where people want to stay and can be at their best.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for these last words. Thank you so much for this very insightful and valuable discussion. Thanks for listening and have a great time here at Weimar Kultursymposium.